compost systems, and we'll start with the tumblers, they will vary by your system in winter composting. So your management practices will vary. So with the tumblers and even with the joras, if you can insulate or cover the tumbler with a tarp, that would be a good practice so that you keep the wind and the snow and all the elements out of it as much as possible. To start off your tumbler, if you can empty all of your materials, because the composting process will be slowed and you'll be adding new materials to it. So if you can empty out as much as possible from the tumblers, do that. And if the materials are ready to cure, set it in a pile and you can cover that curing material with a tarp. If they're not ready to cure, either leave them in a tumbler, or if you have a bin system that is connected to your tumblers, put the materials in the bins, and we'll cover over the bins in just a moment. So if you can also, if you don't have a roof over the tumbler, again, cover it with a tarp, and maybe put some hay bales over on the side, around the sides of the tumblers and underneath, just to give it a little more moisture and some protection from the elements, because really the wind is what gets to the tumblers and freezes everything. And then you can also empty the tumbler and maybe put it in a greenhouse for warm composting, or in a shed or in a roof. And they're easy enough to do that if the materials are out of it. And as Kat mentioned, you do want to regularly turn the tumbler to keep the materials from getting frozen, because they may get frozen. And the more you can aerate it and turn it, particularly as you add more materials, and keep your recipe balanced, just as you would in the summer and other times and other seasons, and keep it aerated, that will help keep your materials going and less frozen and more active. But never fear, it may likely freeze, as Kat mentioned. And then on warm days, just get there, and if you can turn it, go ahead and turn it. And if not, just let it set and then come back to it in the summer. But do prepare, if you are continuing to keep your food scraps collection going in the winter, have a backup plan for your joras, and rely maybe more on your bins, or make a separate pile that you can add your food scraps to. Okay, so go ahead, Natasha, next slide. So on your compost bins, again, because decomposition will slow, you'll want to remove as much of the materials that are ready for curing from the bins. And if you can, and then cover it like your curing pile, and then combine all of your remaining materials into one bin, provided you've got extra bins, and then start that as your first compost bin, and start adding your food scraps to that bin. And then once that's full, you can move on to another bin and start adding materials. So, and you want to start your bin with a thick layer of carbon materials. So if you're combining all of your other materials that aren't finished composting into one bin, put a layer of thick carbon materials down, like leaves or livestock manure bedding is best if you've got it, but leaves and other carbon sources will do as well. Dig a well in the center for placing the food scraps, and then cover that food scraps with wood shavings or carbon. If you have wood shavings, which hopefully you'll have a stockpile of, wood shavings work really well for covering the food scraps initially, because as Kat mentioned, there are a lot of wildlife still out, and they will come out on warmer days in the winter. So the wood shavings will help control the odors. Also, wood shavings do not take up the volume that leaves and straw and other carbon materials do. So that would just save space in both your jora and your bin systems. And then continue this layering process through the winter. So, and also, as Kat mentioned, and same thing with the joras, you do really want to try to get as much air in your bins as possible. So if you can't turn them regularly, which we understand because it's going to get heavy and wet and with the snow, but at least try poking your pitchfork in there and fluffing it up. That'll be really good. So insulating your bins, again, that's a really important thing to do. If you don't have a permanent roof on top of your bins or any lids, try to manufacture some kind of lid, either through with plywood, sheet metal, or even a tarp. And that'll just keep the snow off of it, and it will help to insulate. If you can do the insulating, the polystyrene rigid foam, that would be really good. And then cover that with a tarp, even if it's just a temporary thing. And again, you can also put a hoop structure around it, or, put a bin in a greenhouse. And then when you're doing that, though, do remember the ease of access, because you're still going to be dealing with snow, and you're still going to be removing snow from the bins. So you want to make sure that the lid and whatever your system is that you're covering the bins with doesn't hamper it or slow it down or become a real problem. So again, using a 2 to 4 inch sheet of the polystyrene, the rigid foam, or blue board, which cats called it. So that's a new term for me, but I guess it's the same thing. So use something like that, and that'd be really good for insulating. And it will keep your microbes happier, because they'll have a nice warm insulation barrier from the snow and the cold and the wind and all of that other stuff. And then you can also add below that a few inches of straw and leaves and cardboard. And then when you're adding your food scraps to the center of your bin carbon materials, just remove that and then put that back over your bin, your food scraps. And then also, if you can add some hay or straw bales around your bins, like the front of the bins and the side of the bins, or even bags of leaves, if you can get those from your food scrap community, then that would be helpful as well for insulation. Remember, the goal is to keep out the wind and the snow, but particularly the wind, and for getting too much cold into the microbes. So there's some examples. You can see the insulation on the top left bin. And then the 2 right bins are actually a project that was done in Maine for the Organic Association there. And this is actually the start of an ASP pile system. And so you can see the insulated foam boards on the sides, as well as the lid for really good composting, winter composting. Oh, and I'm sorry, this is another one that Kat can tell you about, but this is the Thedford Elementary School, really fancy bin system, and it's got a roof to it, and you can see the insulation. And Kat, do you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, this is a student-run composting system at Thetford Elementary. The 5th and 6th graders run the system with some guidance from adults such as myself. And they put 6,000 pounds of food scraps through this system every school year. And we compost mostly during the winter because it's a school. As we've gone on over the years, we've actually rebuilt bins after this, and our new bins do not have blue board. We've learned that as long as our active bin has blue boards, so we always add only to one bin, which is the one all the way on the right that is closed in this bin system. So we do keep blue board on the side and back of that bin, but the rest of them we don't. Those are where curing piles go, and we actually don't mind if they freeze. It's totally fine. And we have found that the carpenter ants eating the blue board and leaving blue board foam on the ground was more of a problem than compost freezing. So we're sort of moving away from blue board. But I can say that in getting this into the school, the blue board rigid foam insulation was a big factor in helping parents and the school nurse and anyone else who was maybe a little concerned about odors, felt more comfortable knowing that there was rigid foam on the outside.
So, and I like the lid mechanism too. So that's a pulley system where you can pull on the rope and lift the lids. Yeah,
that works great.
So that's a great system.
Slightly dangerous for little kids, but so far so good.
Thanks. Yeah, and the insulation, the blue board and other kinds of rigid foam doesn't have to stay there all year round. So if you want to just put it in temporary, that's certainly a great thing to do for winter management of your bins. Okay, so windrows. The best thing to do for your windrows is if you can start out by digging out the ground and putting about a foot or two, and then merging any, if you have two windrows or more, combining them into one windrow, and then putting that combined windrow, turning it into this submerged channel, and that will help to really insulate the windrow system. And this is the same thing for piles if you're going to start a pile system in the winter. So you want to start out with adding your food scraps and a high nitrogen manure just to really boost your system. And again, this, as was mentioned earlier by Natasha, start out like with a boost of nitrogen to your system so that you go into winter having that most active system that you can. And that will get your microbes really active and really running in hot compost. And then it can cool down, and it's not going to make as much difference, and it will keep your microbes more active as the winter goes through. So start out with a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio than you normally would in other seasons. And again, add some mixy, woody kind of materials like old crop residues and such to add bulk and create air pockets. And then fluff your materials before covering. And we're going to go into covering. So next slide, Natasha. Next, for insulating the windrows, you do want to cover with carbon materials, and that can be finished compost. You can use wood shavings, aged manure, and bedding is excellent for covering your windrows. Similar again to the bins, straws, leaves, that will work as well. And if you have a smaller windrow, you can always put a tarp or a canvas cover over it as well. For windrows, you want to not turn as frequently in the winter, and you want to turn on warmer days. So how you add your food scraps is you keep an opening at one end of the windrow, and that's where you'll put your food scraps. You want to cover and or bury the food scraps at that one end. So it's kind of like the bins. You dig up a little hole on the end of the windrow, put your food scraps in it, and then cover that with wood shavings or carbon. If you can, make that hole on the south side of your bins for maximum sun and warmth exposure. So you can pile the snow on top of your windrow to add added insulation, and as the snow melts, that adds water in for maintaining moisture levels as well. So here's an example of a covered windrow, and then this picture right here, somewhere in Vermont, and you can see that they have a pretty thick covering of either aged compost or some kind of other carbon material. And that's your windrow systems. So if you have an aerated static pile or bin system, if you're using a forced air system and you don't have electricity to it in the winter, if you're using a solar system that may be turned off, you can just leave your system in, your piping in, you don't have to remove it. You can also insulate the forced air system housing if you want to do that, because chances are if you don't insulate it, the system will freeze up and just slow down. Moisture may get into the perforated piping, and it can slow the airflow. It's not a huge problem. It's not going to, gum up your system too much, and it will obviously when the weather gets warmer. And if you don't have a lot of moisture in it, you don't have to worry about it. But piping underground, so as it's going into your windrow or going into your bins, you don't have to worry about that. For bin systems, you're likely to have some exposed piping. So then you can insulate that with heat tape if you want, or just other kinds of insulation, or you can even put hay bales around the system. If you have a bigger system, the leach channel should be below the frost line, or they definitely need to be insulated, because that can stop your leachate from flowing out, and that can be an issue. So that's it on the aerated static pile systems. This is an example of aerated systems. The one on the left is Sunrise Farm, and Kat can chime in on that if she'd like. And then the one on the right is a simple aerated static pile, not a forced air system. So, and you can see how well insulated it is, covered with the hay over the top.
Kat, yeah, I can say a little bit about the Sunrise system. So the system, I think, is 3 years old now. Sunrise partners with a local entrepreneur, Willow Tree Community Compost, who picks up from area residents, schools, businesses, and drops off food scraps weekly, I think twice a week, at Sunrise Farm. They manage thousands of pounds of food scraps now, and they're figuring out how to get through winter. So far, they've been pretty good at it. They have an aerated static system that I believe they're able to continue using throughout the winter. Their big challenge is buckets. You know, how do we deal with the buckets in the wintertime? Willow Tree does the washing. They have a setup right there, but you know, the hose and the ice and all of that, but they do continue to go through the winter. It's just a bit more challenging, maybe a lot more challenging would be fair to say, to manage all that bucket washing through the winter time. So these guys, they have a pad that they blend on, and that's where the food scraps get dumped. And the farm will come in with a tractor and blend all of those ingredients with the proper feedstocks, and then move them into the piles, the aerated static piles where they start cooking. So this is a pretty great system, and Chuck at Sunrise Farm is pretty open to sharing that system. So if it's a thing you want to go check out, I highly recommend that.